The Functional Economy, The Bases of Economic Organization by Bernard W. Dempsey, S.J. Chapter 1, Biography of an Unsatisfactory Science. Economics is concerned with the activities of men, singly and associated, in making a living. Making a living is a subject that is obviously of the greatest scientific and, at the same time, of the greatest practical importance. For this reason, the economist must constantly deal with two sets of problems on totally different levels. First, he seeks for those relationships that have sufficient uniformity and stability to merit the name of laws or principles, and he tries to formulate these into theorems of more or less general validity. At the same time, each generation and each historical period has its own peculiar economic problems that assume an urgency for the people who must live with them. A problem of great practical significance may, from an analytical point of view, be quite simple. There is no necessary relation between the bread and butter importance of an economic problem and its relevance to the study of economics of general validity. A local problem that endangers the standard of living may be simple or complex from an analytical point of view, and so may a national or international problem. Nevertheless, the economist, like everyone else, is the child of his own generation and is impressed by what he lives with. The progress of economic science has been both speeded and retarded by the fact that economists almost inevitably have dealt with the problems of their own times. Progress has come from the honest intellectual work that went into the analysis of the local or temporary situation. Progress has been hampered when the analysis of the local and temporary situation came to be regarded as of general and eternal validity. The beginnings of a science. The Greeks. The word economics is derived from two Greek words, oikos, house, and nomos, law, rule. The basic historical idea, therefore, may be rendered as household administration. This phrase contains the central ideas of the science, the allocation of limited resources toward achieving some practical objective of a livelihood for the persons comprising some community, in this case the household. In Greek society, at its cultural peak, 350 BC, the household was the unit of consumption as it is now, but it was also the unit of production and was not commonly limited to one couple and their offspring. In their analysis of this household making a living, Greek writers, especially Aristotle, died 322 BC, isolated and illuminated many of the core notions of economics. These included the ideas of exchange, price, and value, the efficiencies of the division of labor, and of the division of resources, since called private property, an analysis of usury and interest that was essentially sound, and a grasp of economic interdependence. In addition, the basic ideas of money are well and clearly outlined, and Aristotle's refutation of Plato's communism in goods and women still stands unanswered. But even such a mind as Aristotle's was limited by his economic horizon. His economics take slavery for granted, an enormously significant economic fact apart from its morality, and he had little concept of even the city-state as an economic unit, somehow economically distinct, at least inadequately, from the households that comprised it. Plato, died 327 BC, had gone to the opposite extreme, conceiving of the state as the warden of welfare in his republic. But this was admittedly an idealistic construction, never intended to be realized. The Romans. During the period of the Roman Republican Empire, 200 BC to AD 400, little progress was made in abstract economic analysis. The art of the Romans lay not in philosophy or in business and commerce. They were soldiers first and administrators afterward. Consequently, we find only a very small number of speculative treatises and only a few practical treatises, chiefly on agriculture. But in the great Roman codes of law, such as those of Theodosius, died 395, and Justinian, died 565, there are innumerable cases of careful analyses of economic situations, on prices, on monopoly, on value, on interest and usury, on contracts of all sorts, on property, and on public regulation of business. The codes, it must be remembered, were not written at one time. They simply codified the laws and judgments that had been in force over many past decades, or even centuries. Hence, a great deal of practical wisdom went into the record of these codes. Perhaps nowhere do we see the direction of economic inquiry governed more completely by the urgencies of the times than in the case of Rome. Obviously, there was no lack of talent among them, as evidenced by their achievements in many fields. But the practical problem that confronted them was, first of all, the government and administration of the many areas their armies subdued, and secondly, the reconciling of the commercial codes of these various countries so that business could be carried on with some appearance of justice, equity, and expedition. Thus, the economist of the Greek period was the philosopher, of the Roman, the lawyer. Christian contributions. The Christian gospel had profound economic effects on the lives of persons and communities from the first days of its preaching, through the doctrine of poverty and renunciation and through its radically new attitude toward manual work, for example. But only from about the time of St. Augustine, died 430, does the effect of Christian revelation upon systematic knowledge begin to appear in economic matters. Augustine dealt incidentally but with penetration on just price and the difference between the metaphysical value of a being and its market value. Fleas have life, and bread has not, but who would not rather have bread in the house than fleas? Here begins a corpus of knowledge that, through varying degrees of influence, has survived to the present day. There have always been two separate but closely intertwined strands to this tradition, that of the canon lawyers and that of the theologians, both dogmatic and moral. Unlike most economists of today, their primary concern was a knowledge of right and wrong, of the utility of material things for promoting spiritual ends. But the fact that economic analysis had a secondary and instrumental place in their analysis did not mean that the analysis was badly done. Three principal problems confronted them: the determination of the just or common price in a relatively isolated market town, the problems of exchange and insurance in the commercial centers with access to salt water, and usury. Two periods saw this analysis at its best: the generation before and after St. Thomas Aquinas, and the period just before and after 1600. As new problems arose, new ideas were developed from the old, and long before 1600, entirely sound principles had been formulated on price, value, money, usury, risk and interest, inflation, taxation, private property, and the division of labor. New systems for new problems. The rise of national states, with first beginnings as early as 1300 in France, began to chip away at the universality of the analysis of schoolmen and canonists. After 1500, a new breed of economists appeared, called cameralists on the continent and mercantilists in England. Adam Smith referred to their doctrines as the continental system, or the system of Europe, though after the Tudors, England played the game as well as anybody. Under the new nationalistic divine right kings who were appearing, the state treasury became the focus of economics and treatises on taxation, especially tariffs. Other forms of public finance, too, especially as affected by foreign exchanges, received extended, if not always far-sighted, treatment. The cameralist prejudice, basically, is a fear of goods and a preference for money, even money of declining value. This fear, which is held by governments and empires large and small, and by monopolists and unionists, flourishes even to this day. An economics of nature. One of the few lines of economic thought that seems to have been primarily speculative in its origins, if not in its effects, was that of the physiocratic group, which emerged in France after the first quarter of the 18th century under the influence of François Quesnay, died 1774, the physician to Louis XIV. This movement was akin to the romantic cult of nature that arose in sophisticated France at about the same time. This naturalism prompted women of the court, who had spent hours on a 30-inch coiffure, to promenade in the late afternoon with a shepherd's crook, communing with nature, and to be painted in stilted and pruned rusticity by Fragonard. Natural laws and laws of nature have had a long and honorable philosophical history, from the Stoics and Cicero through the Scholastics, who greatly refined the concept of a state of nature in contrast with an order of grace. Quesnay's group were the first to call themselves economists, but they have largely been called by the name given their system, physiocrats. Quesnay was impressed by the incontestable fact that all material wealth comes in some fashion from the earth. In view of this, he advocated a single tax on land as the ultimate source of value. In spite of the obvious truth contained in the first premise, the conclusion grossly undervalues the utility of time and place and all the enormous utilities of form that are due to human effort as opposed to those produced by nature alone. Of greater practical importance than his single tax proposal was an attitude fostered by Quesnay's thought that the impressive economic ills of 18th century France were wholly due to human bungling. In the background awaited a benign and powerful nature ready to raise everybody to a higher standard of living as a reward for observing passively her laws. The Times made this easy to believe. Tax farmers took huge sums for a remote court that did the people no apparent good. Guilds that had lost their historical foundation and with it their economic orientation had degenerated in some cases into artificial monopolies, levying a toll on goods for no commensurate service. From these facts and attitudes was derived the slogan, Laissez faire, laissez passer, le monde va de soi-même. Thus, an ancient and useful concept became a formula for all protests against all manner of things that appeared undesirable to the critic. Whatever natural law may mean in mechanics and the physical universe, it had been long and widely perceived that in the moral universe, untiring effort of the human intelligence was required to learn the natural law, an equal effort of intelligence and will to carry it out. Quesnay's position made the natural law a principle of mechanics operating rigidly, promptly, and with uniform effect in the moral domain. In 1778, when the guilds of Paris had been summarily abolished, the order had to be rescinded because nature did not roll up her sleeves to do the work of the Water Carriers Guild. Quesnay's curious reaction to his times might have passed into the limbo of inadequate systems had it not been for its supremely timely introduction into England by a learned and studious revenue collector and professor of moral philosophy named Adam Smith. Smith had spent much time in France with the school of Quesnay and had been greatly impressed by them. England also was suffering from strangulation by mercantilist policies, both internal and external. Remnants of guild control were less vexatious than in France, but numerous royal patents of monopoly and an involved pattern of taxes, tariffs, and regulations produced a highly artificial disposition of resources. Against this, Smith proposed the easy system of natural liberty. Smith's work was entitled An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, 1776, and included a vast number of ideas, some quite sound on subjects such as education and government, that obviously do have a bearing on the causes of the wealth of nations. His discussion of the economic advantages of the division of labor is classic, but under physiocratic influence he saw what was actually arrived at without interference as natural, and what was natural as good. Among the things that were natural was a wage rate that tended to the level of subsistence. Smith's work, though perfectly timed and immensely popular, was not a closely reasoned treatise. Even the seemingly rigid analytical parts were much tempered by the discussions of the effects of social institutions. In 1789, 13 years after the publication of The Wealth of Nations, the French Revolution erupted and 2 years later was taken over by Napoleon, whose actions dominated the continent and England for the next 24 years. During this period, England felt acutely the advantages and disadvantages of her insular position, which protected her from invasion but cut off her access to important food supplies. During this period of wartime inflation and limited food, there was a temporary sharp opposition among the social classes in England. If grain was plentiful and cheap, wages could be low. The entrepreneur class made money. If food was scarce and expensive, the landowning squires made money. Wages in either case were close to the margin of subsistence. The problem of distribution. A brilliant and wealthy stockbroker, David Ricardo, died 1823, analyzed this situation with great acumen. Unlike Adam Smith, Ricardo was not interested in the causes of the wealth of nations. To him, the central problem of economics was a relative one. What determines the relative share of annual output that goes to those who contribute labor, wages, those who contribute land, rents, and those who contribute capital and management, interests and profits. This is the problem of distribution, and it has occupied a central place in economics ever since Ricardo's day. It is a legitimate problem, but it can easily be posed in a misleading way, because the conclusions are most significant when the economic factors and the social classes are practically coextensive. In a nation of owner-managed farms, the analysis would still be useful. but its social significance would be much less than in an economy where ownership was less widely diffused. But Ricardo considered only the economy of England under the strains of the Napoleonic Wars, and described it as an economic system whose analysis was of universal validity. As the 19th century progressed, cumulative technical improvements made possible not only an increasing population, but an increased population with a rising standard of living. That standard was not high for everybody. For instance, in comparison with a present-day American manufacturing city of 50,000 where practically everybody is American-born, but it was higher than it had previously been in England, and it averaged higher than on the continent. In spite of this, Karl Marx, a doctor of philosophy, after long studies of British official papers in the British Museum, announced his own interpretation of England's adjustment to economic change. He added Ricardo's labor theory of value to Ricardo's opposition of interests of economic factors and subtracted private property, thus producing the theory of class conflict. At its worst, Ricardo's theory said nothing about the absolute standard of living. The conflict was purely mathematical and relative. If my share moves from 33% to 34%, someone else's must go down because there are only 100%. But 32% may be a better living than 33% if the 100% to be divided has increased in the meantime. Marx made the opposition absolute and made the exclusive character of and the identification of economic factors and social classes complete. The resulting class conflict, by a sketchy historical analysis, he made not only universal, but perpetual. This whole system was built around the philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel to give it a dynamically inevitable character. The workers are the sole cause of value, but the workers do not get the whole value. Therefore, the workers are exploited to the extent that they do not receive the whole value. Since the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, the day of the proletariat was bound to come when they would expropriate the expropriators and take over the economy for themselves. A modern look at the science. To this point, we have attempted merely to illustrate the following facts. 1. No matter how much economists may strive for principles of general validity, the problems of their own times condition at least the direction, if not the content, of their efforts. 2. In spite of important breaks in the flow of systematic economic knowledge, such as ignorance of Aristotle for centuries and neglect of the schoolmen in the 18th and 19th centuries, progress has been made. And 3. Especially during the last 50 years, in which all the resources of the history of the science have been available to scholars, it has been easier to avoid the repetition of previous error and to capitalize on previous good work. Our generation has its own problems. In attacking them, we will not regard them as unique, nor will conclusions based upon the analysis of them be extended beyond the limits warranted by the data, unless supported by the tradition of economists. We are fortunate that one of the great economists of all time has in our day published a history, but not of economic doctrines as usually done dealing with the work of men in schools linked with the problems of their day. Joseph A. Schumpeter, in his History of Economic Analysis, has re-examined the history of economic thought, seeking to isolate the emergence of the pieces of analytical apparatus, theorems, and definitions, the tools of analysis that make up economic science. One of the major theses of Schumpeter's history is that the intellectual quality of the analysis contained in an economic publication has nothing to do with its external success, its popularity, or its effect on economic policy. What takes effect and why is one of the difficult questions for the historian to answer. Only this fact, which the book strongly stresses, prevents us from forecasting the most sweeping and enduring influence for Schumpeter's history. Every criterion except the caprices of professional favor indicates a book that will make history as well as record it. Schumpeter brought to his task a broad education molded by diversified experience. Most of his life he was an academic man, but there were important interludes and, even in the academic phases, extraordinary variety. The book is marked by a detachment that is the product of this variety. When this detachment is viewed in connection with his great gift of language and his incredible memory, we have almost the perfect equipment for the historian. Latin, Greek, his native German, French, English, Italian, Spanish, and mathematics all were tools that fitted easily into his hands. Furthermore, history aided magnificently in the timing of his life. He was old enough to have known the Austrians in his youth and in his last years saw the Keynesians in their youth reshaping the United States. It is essential to understand that this is a history of economic analysis and of this alone. It is not a history of economic thought, much less a history of praising economic policy. Marx qualifies as an economic analyst only after considerable scrutiny, but he is finally admitted because ideologically distorted analysis is still analysis. It may even yield elements of truth. Yet Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin receive merely a footnote. Even a reader who does grasp the purpose of this book, and who knows how to distinguish economic analysis from political economy, might still object that I do not report on the works of these three men, or at least on the voluminous works of Lenin. The answer has been given already. However great their historical importance in other respects, as contributors to economic analysis, they are negligible. On the other hand, the scholastic doctors, as we will see, are credited with notable advances in analysis to which their theological preoccupations constituted no bar. Thomas Munn, usually accorded a full treatment in similar histories, is here briefly noted as having a primitive yet substantially sound economics and then taken to task for his errors. But a footnote again concedes that if in this book we were interested in doctrines and policies for their own sake, we should have to rank him very high. Here then, the great names of economics are being reappraised on a new scale. What is that scale? It is not scientism. Hayek's essays against scientism are heartily recommended. It is not exclusive. My thesis does not imply, of course, that human action itself and the psychic processes associated with it, motives and methods of reasoning, whether political or economic or of any other type, are uninfluenced by or uncorrelated with philosophical or religious or ethical convictions. We are not questioning that religious or philosophical elements must indeed enter into any explanations of this behavior whenever they aim at completeness or realism. Actually, Schumpeter's brief background essays on philosophical and sociological settings of economic analysis in various periods are more illuminating than most works. It is not liberal. We have to bar a fire escape by which some of the strongest exponents of the doctrine that economics, and in principle all science, is vitiated by ideological delusions have tried to escape from the apparently inevitable conclusion concerning the possibility of scientific truth. Professor K. Mannheim taught that, though ideological delusion is the common fate of mankind, there are nevertheless detached intelligences floating freely in space who enjoy the privilege of being exempt from this fate. Slightly more realistically, everyone is a victim of ideological delusion except the modern radical intellectual, who stands indeed upon the rock of truth, the unbiased judge of all things human. Now, if anything can be called obvious in this field, it is the fact that this intellectual is just a bundle of prejudices that are, in most cases, held with all the force of sincere conviction.